Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on the President's Budget and the Outlook for Fiscal Year 2021. My name is Sonia Costa. I'm a policy analyst at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, and this webinar today is being hosted by the Campaign for Housing and Community Development Funding, or CHCDF. CHCDF is an education strategy and action hub led by the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. The coalition of more than 70 national organizations work to ensure the highest allocation of resources possible to support affordable housing and community development. CHCDF members represent a full continuum of national housing and community development organizations, including faith-based, private sector, financial intermediary, public sector, and advocacy groups. Really excited that all of you could join us for today's webinar. We are going to start by discussing the general overview for fiscal year 2021, what's kind of going to be coming up for the new funding year. And then we're going to dive into the President's budget request for various affordable housing and community development programs. And then finally, we'll close by discussing some opportunities for advocacy and then opening it up for some questions. So thankfully, I am joined today by several of our wonderful CHCDF partners. They're going to be helping me kind of dig into some of the programs and what is needed for these programs in fiscal year 21, as well as what the President requested. So I'm going to get us started by just kind of discussing the general outlook for FY 2021. So the presidential election is most likely going to affect the annual appropriations process that Congress must complete to fund the government every year. Just kind of want to make sure that everyone knows that because the timeline may look a little different than how it's supposed to look. So the process really began last Monday when the President released his budget request. Excuse that siren in the background. This request is not law. It's just a way for the President to communicate his priorities. Ultimately, of course, all spending decisions are up to Congress. But it is important to understand what the President is proposing because, sometimes Congress does take interest in the different proposals in the budget request. And there are several policy proposals in the budget request as well. So after the President releases their budget, the first step for Congress is deciding the top line number for each of the 12 annual spending bills. This is known as the 302B allocation, and the House and the Senate will each have their own 302B allocations for each of the 12 bills. Once these are decided, the subcommittees can then start drafting their bills. So the House Transportation and Housing and Urban Development Subcommittee is likely to release its bill in April or May. House leadership has said that they would like to pass in the House all 12 bills by June. Again, this is partly because of the election coming up in November. They want to get things done quickly. The timing on the Senate side is a little less clear, but it's probably going to be similar, where the Transportation and Housing Subcommittee will release a draft bill sometime this spring or early summer. We don't anticipate that any of the bills will be passed by both chambers and signed into law before the presidential election in November. Because Congress is divided right now, each party will probably want to wait to see the results of the election before finalizing this process, just in case they can get a more favorable result. So that means that Congress is likely to pass a stopgap funding measure known as a continuing resolution that will go until at least mid-November. After that, Congress and the President, or whoever that may be, will likely resume negotiations after that, figuring out timing. So there may be additional continuing resolutions to get through maybe January or February, and then, or potentially Congress could just decide to go ahead and pass all of the bills and fund the government for fiscal year 2021. So funding in FY 2021 is going to be pretty tight. Last year, Congress and the President agreed on a budget deal that would lift the severe spending caps put in place by the 2011 Budget Control Act, and that deal was for both fiscal year 2020, which is the current fiscal year, and fiscal year 2021. This deal did save critical programs from austere cuts, but did not allow enough funding to get affordable housing and community development programs back to the spending levels that they had prior to the Budget Control Act. So even though we've seen some gains, these levels are still not at 2010 levels, which was the last year before the Budget Control Act went into effect. Luckily, but the Budget Control Act was only for 10 years, meaning that fiscal year 2021 was the last year that we needed to negotiate to get rid of these caps. So fiscal year 2022 will be kind of going back to an old way of doing things. So last year's budget agreement only allowed for a small increase in non-defense funding. So Congress has about $5 billion in additional funding for FY 2021 compared to current levels of FY 2020. Now, this amount could increase. It would depend on receipts from the Federal Housing Administration, which could provide additional sources of revenue. And the 2020 census might not require all the funding that Congress has appropriated for it, which would then mean some of that money would go back and be available for other programs. Even with that, costs for veterans' health care are likely to eat up a lot of these additional resources. Just the projected cost for those programs is incredibly high, and it's obviously an important priority. So we need to just make sure in our advocacy that folks understand that affordable housing also needs additional funds. Affordable housing programs are tied to rents and other market rates, and the cost to maintain the cost to maintain the same level of assistance increases every year. At a time when only 1 in 4 eligible people for housing assistance actually receive it, and millions of people are cost burdened, we can't afford to lose any resources. So we need to make sure that at the very least we have sufficient funding so that no one loses assistance. This tight funding is a big concern for fiscal year 2021. We'll be talking a little bit more about what you can do about it toward the end of the webinar. So now we'll talk a little bit more about the President's budget. This is just a very kind of general look at what was in it before getting into some of the program details. So similar to previous requests, the President's budget proposal included major cuts to HUD funding, about $8.6 billion or 15.2% of enacted levels. In addition, as with previous years, the President also proposed policies to increase rents and allow for work requirements and time limits. So now I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Seth Embry, and he is going to talk a little more about, he will talk more about public housing and housing choice voucher accounts and what was proposed in the budget request. So Seth?
Yes, Sonia, thank you very much. All right. Did I do that? All right, perfect. So thanks, everyone. I will be talking about, as Sonia said, both the public housing accounts and tenant-based rental assistance, also known as the Housing Choice Voucher Program. So some large items that I did want to use to lay the groundwork. As Sonia already mentioned, the President's budget, all of the numbers in the rental assistance accounts assume that Congress will also pass its rent reform legislation, which would raise rents, as was just previously stated, which would institute work requirements. And those aren't small measures. When this was first rolled out in 2018, it was estimated that they would garner about somewhere in the neighborhood of $2 billion across all the programs, these measures. And so they're not insignificant, and they're certainly not insignificant a 5% increase, for instance, from 30 to 35% in your rent would not be insignificant for low-income people. But I did want to set that stage. And also, if you read the budget and if you've seen any analysis thus far, you also know something special this year that the department did, which is to separate funding for what are known as moving to work agencies, or MTW. And those are agencies, right now there are 39 of them. In 2016, Congress approved the expansion of that group by 100 agencies, 30 of which should begin in this calendar year. That remains to be seen. But those agencies have special flexibilities in funding and what to do with their funding, have special flexibilities and have received waivers for certain regs and things like how to calculate rent and other things, and do a lot of alternative development and things like that. And so with the department breaking out that spending, or not the spending, breaking out the budget request for those agencies, in my presentation I roll it all together just to make comparisons simple. But in that analysis that FADA has done in other organizations, we break out that MTW number just so that can be seen. It remains to be seen if those are really reliable figures. The department hasn't been transparent in terms of how the calculations were done to estimate, for instance, how the additional 30 agencies are budgeted for. And so there's a lot of questions about that, but it's very detailed and we won't get into it now except for what I've just mentioned. The one thing I will say is that the appropriators, when this was first rolled out, reminded HUD that proposal needs to go through the authorizing committees, financial services in the House and the banking committee in the Senate. Now the committee looks like they're going to take up this proposal again, and so it's really going nowhere. But the department continues to push it. What I want to talk about first is the tenant-based rental assistance account, again known as Section 8, or the Housing Choice Voucher Program. So there are two parts of that account. There are renewals, and there's two main parts, I should say: renewals and administrative fee. Renewals, those are the funds that continue to help currently assisted households, and the administrative fee are the monies that allow PHAs to operate these programs, so conduct eligibility screenings, maintain their wait list, do inspections, landlord outreach, and things of that nature. This year, the administration has requested $21.131 billion for tenant-based rental assistance for the renewals. And that's a 2% decrease from last year, what was enacted in FY20. Okay, I'm sorry for the screen. So that's a decrease in dollars, $371 million. The cost, however, of the program escalate every year, and this level of funding would lead to reductions in households assisted. Estimates range from 100,000 households to 160,000 households. Again, it's a very complicated formula in terms of how to calculate renewals, and so these are estimates. But what's for sure is that the department, the budget doesn't request full funding for that program for renewals. On the administrative fee account, the administration is requesting $1.8 billion, and this is a 9% decrease from FY20, and is, as you see there, a 70% proration. So what this means is that HUD has a formula to calculate the amount of money needed to manage this program across the country, and what they're proposing is to fund agencies at 70% of what the actual need is. So that means there's less money to do all those things that I mentioned and more, less money to provide customer service, less money to work with service partners in the community to provide services to your voucher participants. And so this cut really hurts agencies because it's harder and harder to get success in that program with tightening rental markets, escalating housing costs, sorts of income discrimination, and things of that nature. And so less money to do that work will really hurt those agencies and will really hurt the families that depend on that assistance. Next, I'll talk about public housing. And so traditionally in public housing, there are two funds, the operating fund and the capital fund. This year, as has been done before, the department proposes to fund agencies through one public housing fund and zero out the capital fund. The capital fund supports capital activities such as the development, modernization, and replacement of public housing, whereas the operating fund provides funds to support routine operations, maintenance, staffing, resident safety, and those types of items. And so that fund is requested at $4.244 billion, which is a 77% decrease from last year. And it also includes $168 million in set-asides that are typically in the capital fund account. And what this means is, although there was a small dip this year in funding compared to FY19, it was under 3%. And so this 7% cut is really serious and really detrimental to the program. And it also is disingenuous because the administration claims to fund the operating fund at 100% of the formula need to do the things I said. However, PHAs are also somehow expected to squeeze out $3 billion in additional capital needs from this smaller pot of money. And so that's it would be a really harmful outcome for residents, for communities all across the country that desperately need to preserve affordable housing and public housing in particular. Eliminating the capital fund reduces the amount of money available for emergency and routine capital needs, safety and security measures, and other critical repairs and preservation activities. It's really, thankfully, a non-starter in the Congress. Whereas the capital fund is underfunded, it does receive, a few $billion every year, which is significant and is much better than receiving nothing, as the president's budget would allow. This here is just a quick chart that we show on the bottom bars. There's from FY99 up into FY20, the various levels of capital funding, and you see after 2010, there were several years of really deep cuts to the capital fund. The orange line shows the backlog of capital needs based on a 2010 report that showed the capital fund backlog in public housing to be $26 billion. That amount of money continues to escalate every year. And so reducing and eliminating the capital fund will really be devastating to that asset. A few last things I want to mention. The department, again, requests $100 million to support RAD transactions. The department eliminates the Choice Neighborhoods Initiative, which allows for massive redevelopment of public housing properties. It increases the Family Self-Sufficiency Program by a little bit to $90 million, and it does expand the Jobs Plus program initiative by $85 million to a total request for $100 million. In closing, as Sonia said, the administration has chosen really to abdicate its responsibility to be a leader in affordable housing issues, but Congress, year after year, has shown leadership in funding these programs, and so she'll talk later about advocacy there, but it'll be really important to continue advocacy to members of Congress on these important programs.
Great, thank you so much. Really appreciate that overview. And now I'm going to turn it over to Moha from the National Housing Trust to talk about project-based rental assistance and housing for special populations.
Great, thanks, Sonia. So my name is Moha Thakur, and I work as a policy associate at the National Housing Trust. So for those of you who don't know, the National Housing Trust, we're a national nonprofit organization, and we're mission-oriented towards the preservation of affordable housing. And we do this through lending, real estate development, energy efficiency solutions, and both state and federal policy. We as an organization own and manage over 4,200 units across 35 properties in 12 states, as well as the District of Columbia. And so, as Sonia mentioned, today I'll be covering project-based rental assistance, or PBRA, and housing for special populations, which includes Section 202, housing for the elderly, and Section 811, housing for persons with disabilities, and what's been requested from the President's FY21 budget. So what is PBRA? So PBRA is Project-Based Rental Assistance. It's a public-private partnership that provides affordable housing for over 1.2 million low and very low income households across the country. The average annual household income for those who receive PBRA is around $13,000, with 64% of PBRA households including someone with a disability or someone who is elderly. So the PBRA program is administered by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and the department provides private owners of multifamily housing with a long-term contract that is renewed annually to make these units affordable. Residents are required to pay 30% of their incomes for rent, and then the federal government pays the difference. However, as Sonia mentioned earlier, according to HUD, all federal assistance nationwide only serves about 25% of those who are actually eligible residents. Section 202 and Section 811 are similar programs to PBRA, however, are focused on supportive housing for the elderly in Section 202, and then supportive housing for persons with disabilities in Section 811. And so looking at FY21 for PBRA, the funding that Congress allocates each year for PBRA is to simply renew the current PBRA contract for an additional 12 months. And as long as private rental market rents increase each year, which they currently are at about 3 to 4%, we should also then expect the PBRA allocation from Congress to increase each year to ensure that low-income residents are not displaced and that all current contracts can be renewed for their full amount. Therefore, we should expect that the PBRA budget should be a little bit higher this year compared to last year's. So while the President's budget for PBRA in FY21 requests an increase of $72 million from the enacted FY20 budget of $12.6 billion, we understand that this amount is not sufficient. The requested budget is based on the assumption that both the rent reforms and the rent freeze will be adopted by Congress, which so far we have seen is not the case. We also understand that the savings that have been associated with this rent freeze are greater than in previous proposals from HUD. And this is due to an assumption that rents have been increasing at a greater rate than in the last 3 years. Additionally, with around 10,000 units coming under the PBRA program through RAD conversions, as Steph briefly mentioned, the PBRA renewal costs will be stretched across even more properties in the coming years. So therefore, the increase in PBRA contract renewals is expected to be more than the $72 million that has currently been requested. And this is an amount that is currently not reflected in the President's FY21 budget request. So looking at Section 202 housing for the elderly, the President's budget has increased the overall account request from $793 million to $853 million, an increase of $60 million in FY21. However, we understand that the renewals of Project Rental Assistance Contracts, or PRACs, are insufficient by at least $18 million in this request. And this is noting that about 1/3 of 202 contracts get their operating subsidy from PRACs and the other 2/3 from PBRA. The FY21 President's budget request has continued to revive funding for new Section 202 homes for the elderly, adding $100 million. So this new construction is a revival of funding for new homes via the Section 202 program. And it's been a particular priority for advocates, as no funding for new Section 202 homes was allocated between 2011 and 2017. Without the administration's support, Congress revived this program in fiscal year 2017. But as you can see from this graph, the funding for new Section 202 homes since 2017 has been far below historic annual funding. So the budget also request includes $95 million that would renew existing contracts for supportive service coordinators, although no funding for new service coordinator contracts. It also recommends extending HUD's 40-site integrated wellness in supportive housing, or IWISH demonstration. It recommends shifting PRAC renewals to 5-year terms instead of 1-year terms, and to use operating cost adjustment factors for these renewals instead of budget-based rent increases. The request also will also seek authorization to exempt Section 202 PRAC properties from the budget-neutral RAD conversion requirement to accommodate services. So we believe that full funding for the renewal of all PRAC and PBRA contracts related to the Section 202 program is vital, as well as an increase in funding for new Section 202 homes, as has been historically present. And finally, I'm going to touch on Section 811, which is housing for persons with disabilities. So looking closely at FY21, the President's budget is asking for a $50 million increase for Section 811 from $202 million to $252 million. We understand that this increase is due to the incremental cost increase for PRAC renewals, as well as an allocation for some new construction of units. Also, for the first time, HUD is expected to receive the first wave of renewals from the Section 811 Project Rental Assistance Demonstration that first began leasing in 2014 and 2015. The increase in funding for FY21 in the 811 program is actually notable, as HUD currently has an outstanding NOFA for $112 million for funding for Section 18, and this was from FY 2018. So in other words, we've seen it take HUD more than a year to actually put out an NOFA for funds that were first allocated in FY 18. So these awards are, the awards for these funds are still months away from actually being made. So it's quite interesting to see that HUD is now asking for an additional $50 million in new funds, particularly so in a budget that fails to provide adequate funding for both PBRA or Section 2 contract renewals. And so, again, would urge everyone to stick around for Sonia to speak more about what advocacy roles we can all play in ensuring that all contract renewals are fully funded for FY21. But with that, I'll pass it on to Vicky, who will speak further about CDBG, home, and HOPA funding requests for FY21.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I'm going to talk first about the CDBG program, and I'm going to transfer the slide here. For those of you who are not aware of the CDBG program, it provides formula grants to state and local governments to support community development, economic development, and affordable housing projects that assist low and moderate income individuals. In the CDBG program, moderate income is considered 51% to 80% of area median income. The program funds are allocated by formula to over 1,200 state and local governments, and program activities focus on four major areas: affordable housing, public improvements, otherwise known as infrastructure, public services, and economic development. The President's fiscal year 21 budget request provides no funding for CDBG. This has occurred in the President's previous budget proposals as well, where he has proposed elimination of funding for CDBG. Last year, we were very pleased to get an allocation of $3.425 billion for CDBG in the fiscal year 20 budget that Congress approved in the fall. This was an increase of $100 million from the previous year, and this increase included $25 million for states to provide temporary housing for persons recovering from substance use disorders. This money is primarily being put in there to help tackle the opioid epidemic. But even with the increase in fiscal year 20, the CDBG program remains critically underfunded. Program was funded at $4.4 billion in 2001. At that time, there were just over 1,000 grantees receiving the money. Today, there's nearly 1,300 grantees that receive CDBG. So the program funding has gone down and the number of grantees has gone up, leaving smaller allocations for folks. The Home Investment Partnership Program, it provides formula grants to state and local governments to fund affordable housing projects for low-income people. Home funds are used for four primary activities: new construction of affordable housing, rehab, down payment assistance, and tenant-based rental assistance. Like CDBG, the President's fiscal year 21 budget requests zero money for home, despite the fact that we're in the throes of an affordable rental housing epidemic in the country. Home is probably the primary HUD program that puts money towards housing production, particularly for rental housing. As with CDBG, also, the President's previous budget proposals also eliminated funding for home. Again, like CDBG, home has bipartisan congressional support, and the program was funded at $1.35 billion in fiscal year 20, which was an increase of $100 million from the previous year. In just like CDBG, home remains underfunded. The program was funded at $1.825 billion in fiscal year 10, and we remain at just 1.35 in fiscal year 20. So, and there's a huge need for affordable housing. The housing opportunities for persons with AIDS programs provides housing and services to low-income persons living with HIV/AIDS. The majority of people assisted through HOPWA are extremely low income, with many of them being homeless. 90% of HOPWA funds are awarded by formula to states and local governments to serve the metropolitan area, and the remaining 10% is awarded via competition to states, local governments, and nonprofit organizations. The President's fiscal year 21 budget requests $330 million for HOPWA. This is a cut of $80 million from last year, when the program was funded at $410 million in fiscal year 20, which was an increase of $17 million from the previous year's level of $393 million. So I will turn it over now to the next speaker.
Great, thank you so much, Vicki. Really appreciate it. And now we will hear from Kim Johnson here at the National Low Income Housing Coalition about homeless assistance grants.
Hi, everyone. So, like Sonia said, my name is Kim Johnson. I'm a policy analyst with the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and today I'll be covering the outlook for homeless assistance grants outlined in the President's FY21 budget request. So a little bit of background. HUD's McKinney-Vento homeless assistance grants fund local programs to keep people who become homeless safe and get them quickly back into housing. Programs covered under McKinney-Vento include both the Emergency Solutions Formula Grant Program and the Continuum of Care Program. Under the FY20 appropriations bill, funding for homeless assistance grants increased to $2.78 billion from $2.64 billion in FY19. $80 million of those funds will be targeted to address youth homelessness in both urban and rural areas. The bill also provides $3.8 million to the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, which the President has repeatedly proposed to eliminate in previous budget requests. The FY20 appropriations bill also includes important legislative language to prevent the administration from undermining evidence-based approaches to ending homelessness through its Notice of Funding Availability, or NOFA, for homeless assistance grants. The bill leaves intact NOFA language from FY18 that emphasizes that grant recipients should follow housing first practices, which have been proven effective at reducing homelessness by a decade of research. The President's budget would essentially flat fund homeless assistance programs at $2.77 billion, a $4 million cut from FY20 enacted levels. The budget doesn't include additional funds for Veterans Affairs Supportive Housing Vouchers, or HUD-VASH program, but it does include $4 million for the Tribal HUD-VASH program. The budget would also fund the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness at $3.8 million, despite previous attempts by the White House to eliminate funding for the department. The congressional justification also mentions a new initiative to reduce quote-unquote street homelessness, but does not provide any details as to what this initiative would entail or any additional funding that it might include. Our colleagues at the National Health Center for the Homeless Council pointed out in their analysis of the President's FY21 budget request that the budget request for Health and Human Services includes $15 million for, quote, primary care to individuals experiencing homelessness in geographic areas with large numbers of unsheltered homeless individuals, but details of how this money would be used or what conditions might be attached are unspecified. We've been keeping a close eye on the administration's actions around homelessness and will continue to monitor to push back on any harmful proposals that might be unveiled. And so our FY21 asks are pretty simple. For the upcoming budget cycle, we will be requesting $3.1 billion for homeless assistance grants programs, which is a $300 million increase from FY20 enacted levels. And that's it from me.
Thanks so much, Kim. Appreciate it. And now I'm going to hand it off to Leslie at the Housing Assistance Council. 1 second, Leslie. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Hi. I'm going to talk about USDA. That went backwards. I'm trying to make the slides go the other way. There we go. USDA's housing programs fall into two major categories. So I've got one slide about home ownership programs, and the next slide will be about rental programs. USDA provides different types of financing for both home ownership and rental, including loans and grants and guarantees. This administration has focused extensively, almost completely, almost exclusively in its past budgets on the guarantee programs because they don't cost the government anything. They charge fees to the private lenders that use them, and then the fees exceed the total amount that they collect exceeds the total amount that the government has to pay out from defaulting borrowers. So it's easy to support those programs. The other programs the administration in the past has zeroed out, and you still see several zeros in the far right-hand column there, but this year they proposed to keep funding level for 3 specific programs that aren't guarantees. One of them is the 504 very low income repair grants. Okay. Sonia, I'm doing something wrong here. Thank you. The 504 programs, there are both loans and grants. They're for the grants are for very low income elderly homeowners with emergency health and safety violations in their homes. So it makes sense that that would be a program you'd want to continue funding. However, I was somewhat surprised to see that the administration proposed to continue funding it. And there isn't really any explanation of how they selected which programs to keep supporting. And you see that also at the bottom. Okay.
I've got you, Leslie.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The good thing I only have 2 slides. If I had more, we'd be in trouble. You see the support for a couple of preservation-related programs at the bottom of the slide. Over in the far right, again, is the 21 budget column. Rental assistance, which keeps tenants in their units, they have steadily supported. Unfortunately, they want to impose a $50 per month minimum rent, which USDA has not had in the past. So far, Congress has not gone along with that, but they are providing enough money in the rental assistance account to renew all the contracts that expire. Same thing with the voucher program. This is not HUD's vouchers. This is USDA's Section 542 vouchers, which are used specifically in connection with preserving existing rental housing when it loses other subsidies. So both of those they've been supportive of in the past. It's nice to see that they proposed a big jump in the voucher program. I don't know how that was calculated. I didn't expect it to need to be that high. And the Multifamily Preservation and Revitalization Program, which is known as MPR, they proposed a big jump in. In the past, this administration has proposed to zero that program out. It's hugely important. Congress has supported it consistently because USDA's multifamily properties are aging and need a lot of physical work and also need financial support as owners are trying to get away from continuing to own affordable rental properties that they've mostly owned for decades, because most of these are pretty old. I hope that Congress will go along with that 40 million. The program could use even more than that. They have a big backlog of needs for preservation work. And I'm happy to answer questions, but that's the basics.
Great, thank you so much, Leslie, appreciate it. And so now just going to kind of wrap up and talk about some ways to take action. So as we've kind of gone over, what the president proposed isn't very good for affordable housing and community development programs. Luckily, during the Trump presidency, Congress has generally ignored the president's budget request, but as advocates, we need to make sure that Congress really understands the need for increased funding for these programs and ignores some of the other potentially harmful policy proposals included in the budget. So the first action that you can take is signing a letter to the chair and ranking member of the Full Appropriations Committee, asking them for a high top-line spending level for housing and transportation programs. So we've been circulating this letter for a few weeks now, but we will send a link in the chat box for you to sign on if you haven't already. The letter is closing tomorrow by the end of the day so that we can get it to the Hill on time, because as I kind of mentioned before, they're working pretty quickly on all of these things, and we want to make sure that they know that the level of support for these programs is incredibly high. So another thing that you can do, I mean, we just always encourage folks to reach out to your members of Congress, and a really great opportunity for doing that will be in May during the Our Homes, Our Voices Week of Action. This is the fourth year that we've done this, NLIHC, with our CHCDF partners, and we're hoping that even more organizations get involved this year. So the week will be May 2nd through 12th, which is a bit longer than a week, but we wanted to make sure that included time when members of Congress are in home and district, as well as here in Washington, D.C. So we encourage folks to invite members of Congress to events or folks to attend the town halls that members are already planning, just as an opportunity to discuss the housing issues in your area and ask them what they're doing around these issues. Events can be super small, just like having a small little phone call making party or writing letters, sending postcards. Or if you want to do something bigger, we have lots of ideas for that as well, like tours of properties, you could do rallies, teach-ins, film screenings, all sorts of things. So if you're interested in doing something, you can learn more about Our Homes, Our Voices next week on February 26th. We'll be doing a webinar that kind of does an overview. If you're already familiar and you've done events in the past and you are hoping to do something again, you can register your event at ourhomes-ourvoices.org. Then a member of the field team here at the National Income Housing Coalition will reach out to you and help you plan. If you are a member of another organization that's involved in CHCDF, feel free to reach out to the field team for that organization as well. We'll help, everyone will be ready to help you plan something and get your members of Congress involved. So those are kind of two things coming up as far as taking action and really pressuring Congress. And just remember, the message really is that these housing programs need increased funding just to maintain that same level of assistance. And what the president has proposed would be really harmful for low-income families across the country. So now I believe we're going to see if we have some questions.
Hi, everyone. This is Brooke Shipwright with the National Coalition Field Team. I'm seeing a couple of questions. I think I typed the link wrong to the letter. Let me get that updated in just a second. But let me first start by asking a question we have. what programs would be impacted by rent increases and by what amount?
Sure. So I can start that and maybe Seth can jump in. Rent increases would be for programs under Section 8. So that would be vouchers, people in public housing, people in PBRA units. And so right now, rent is decided by 30% of your adjusted, right, or your gross, of your adjusted income. And then what the president's budget is proposing is that it would be 35% of your gross. So that would be before taxes. And then it would also triple minimum rents on the very lowest income people. It would either be 30% of your income or $50, or $150, whichever is higher. And so that's one way that they're, trying to say that they would be saving money is by increasing these costs for low-income families. I don't know if folks want to jump in, add anything that I've missed or that I said incorrectly.
This is Leslie. I don't have anything to correct about what you said, but just to mention again that for USDA tenants in both Section 515 rental properties and in farm worker housing 514, 516 properties, the budget suggests a minimum rent of $50 a month. As I said in the past, Congress has rejected that proposal, so hopefully they will do that again.
Yeah, thanks for adding that, Leslie. Yeah, the Trump administration did put out a piece of proposed legislation that no one ever picked up and introduced. That was back in 2018. Especially now with Democrats in control of the House, they have really no interest in doing that. So I think for the time being, we can continue to assume that these policy proposals will not be going anywhere.
Great. So we did have a few questions about if the PowerPoint slides will be shared afterwards. They will be made available to everyone. I did type that in the chat box, but for those of you on the phone only, I wanted to make sure that you're aware that you will be getting those as well. It does not look like we have any other questions, so team did a great job covering the topic today.
Great. Thanks everyone for joining. And as you can see, here's our contact information up here. If you have more specific questions about programs or just general questions about ways to get involved, please feel free to reach out to us. A lot of our organizations also put out more detailed analysis about the president's budget as well that you can read and dig into. So thanks everyone. Enjoy the rest of your Tuesday afternoon.